There is oil rising from the bottom of Bikini Atoll right now. Not in 1941, not in 1946. Now, slow dark drops climbing through 52 meters of clear Pacific water, breaking the surface above a wreck that most people have never thought about since high school history class. The ship down there is the Nagato, Japan's most famous battleship, the vessel from whose radio room Admiral Yamamoto ordered the attack on Pearl Harbor. It survived the entire Pacific War without being sunk by a single enemy shell. The United States blew it up deliberately in 1946 as part of a nuclear weapons test, watched it go down overnight, and then left it there. It has been on the bottom ever since. It is radioactive. It is still leaking. It sits inside a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And nobody, not Japan, not the United States, not the Marshall Islands, has a plan for what to do with it. Before we start, what part of the world are you in? Drop a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe. Right now, the Nagato sits upside down on the seafloor of Bikini Atoll lagoon in the Marshall Islands, its hull resting at roughly 52 meters. Divers who descend to it find a structure still recognizable as a warship, but barely. The steel is heavily corroded. Coral and marine growth have colonized the gun turrets, the deck fittings, the superstructure. The whole thing is inverted, so what was once the main deck now faces the sediment, and the keel points toward the surface, like the spine of something enormous and dead. It is simultaneously 4 different things at once: a protected UNESCO heritage site, a measurable source of radioactive contamination, a war grave with uncertain contents, and an active recreational dive destination. Divers pay to swim through its corridors. Radiation levels inside are still detectable. Oil continues to seep from its fuel tanks in documented, recurring sheens. That combination of conditions, heritage status, ongoing contamination, active tourism, unresolved hazard, is what makes the Nagato one of the strangest maritime objects still existing anywhere in the world. And the stranger part is that this is not a crisis nobody noticed. Everyone knows. Nothing has been done. The Nagato was launched in November 1920 and was, at that moment, arguably the most powerful battleship afloat. It was the flagship of the Imperial Japanese Navy for over 2 decades. In November 1941, it was anchored in Hitokapu Bay when Admiral Yamamoto, commanding the combined fleet from aboard the Nagato, transmitted the order that sent the Pearl Harbor strike force south. Climb Mount Nitaka. That signal went out from the ship's radio room. The Nagato carried it through the entire war, one of only 2 Japanese battleships still floating when Japan surrendered in September 1945. The Americans took it. It was structurally intact, battle-scarred but seaworthy, and the US Navy sailed it to Bikini Atoll as part of Operation Crossroads, a 1946 series of nuclear detonations intended to test the effects of atomic weapons on naval vessels. The Nagato was positioned as a target ship among dozens of captured and obsolete vessels. It survived the first detonation, the aerial blast designated Able, on July 1, 1946. 4 days after the second detonation, the underwater blast called Baker sank. The exact time is unrecorded. Nobody was watching. It went down sometime in the night of July 29 to 30, and when morning came, it was gone. The obvious question is why it was never recovered, and the obvious answer from 1946 is straightforward enough. The entire target fleet had been saturated by the Baker detonation, an underwater nuclear blast that proved far worse for contamination than the aerial one. Irradiated water had washed over every surface. It had penetrated every opening. The Joint Army-Navy Task Force 1 report, produced after Operation Crossroads, acknowledged that standard decontamination methods had failed across the fleet. Most surviving target ships were eventually scuttled or disposed of in subsequent years because nobody could make them safe. The Nagato was already on the bottom, inverted, at a depth that 1946-era salvage technology could not easily address. The Marshall Islands were a US trust territory at the time, meaning there was no independent local authority to demand action. So the calculation was simple: the ship was unreachable, the lagoon was already contaminated, and there was no strategic reason to spend resources recovering a Japanese flagship from the bottom of a nuclear test site. The report noted its loss. No salvage recommendation was made. That was 1946. The ship has been there for nearly 80 years since. The question is why that decision has never changed. The Baker detonation was the worst possible kind of nuclear event for the ships it surrounded. An aerial blast sends a shockwave outward and upward. An underwater blast sends a column of irradiated water in every direction, coating every hull, flooding every opening, saturating every surface with radioactive particles that standard scrubbing could not remove. The Nagato absorbed that contamination into its steel, its paint, its interior spaces, its fuel. NOAA surveys and subsequent scientific assessments of the Bikini wrecks have confirmed that residual radiation remains detectable across multiple vessels in the lagoon. Cesium-137, a byproduct of nuclear fission with a half-life of approximately 30 years, has been found in fish tissue and lagoon sediment in studies conducted as recently as the 2010s. The lagoon is not uniformly dangerous. Recreational diving is permitted and takes place regularly, but the contamination is not gone. It is dispersed, settled, and partially decayed, but it persists. The Nagato is not simply an inert relic sitting on the bottom. It is a contaminated steel mass embedded in a living reef ecosystem, and the oil still seeping from its fuel tanks carries whatever it carries through water that divers and marine life share. That is not a metaphor. It is a documented, ongoing condition. On paper, the solution seems straightforward. Send a salvage team, cut the hull open, drain the remaining fuel, remove the contaminated material, solve the problem. In practice, almost every step of that process is either technically dangerous, legally prohibited, financially unrealistic, or some combination of all three. The hull has been corroding in salt water for nearly 8 decades. Marine engineers who have assessed the Bikini wrecks consistently note that large-scale physical intervention risks catastrophic structural collapse, meaning that attempting to cut into or lift sections of the Nagato could cause the entire structure to fail, dispersing contaminated sediment across the lagoon in quantities far exceeding the current slow seep. The wreck sits at 52 meters, which is within recreational diving range but well outside practical large-scale engineering range, without enormous cost and specialized equipment. Beyond the engineering problem, the UNESCO World Heritage designation granted to Bikini Atoll in 2010 legally restricts physical intervention. The wrecks are classified as protected cultural heritage. Additionally, crew members died aboard the Nagato during the war years before the nuclear tests, and as with many wartime vessels of its size, the possibility that human remains are still present somewhere inside the inverted hull cannot be ruled out. That gives it war grave status under international norms, adding another layer of legal and ethical restriction. The Marshall Islands gained independence in 1986, but the US retains nuclear liability agreements from the Compact of Free Association, yet those agreements do not translate into a clear salvage obligation. No single government currently owns this problem completely. This is where the situation becomes genuinely paradoxical. The Marshall Islands government actively promotes the Bikini Atoll wrecks as a dive destination. The Nagato is one of the featured sites. International divers travel significant distances to descend to it, to swim through its inverted corridors, to photograph the coral-covered gun turrets pointing toward the sediment. It generates tourism revenue and international attention for a nation that has very few of either. Removing or remediating the wreck would destroy the very asset the government is marketing. At the same time, oil sheens have been documented appearing above the wreck site on a recurring basis. The divers who pay to explore it are swimming in water above a contaminated hull that is slowly releasing material into the environment they are diving through. The Marshall Islands also carries an entirely separate, unresolved wound. The Bikinian people were displaced from their home atoll in 1946 to make the nuclear tests possible. They were told the displacement was temporary. Most have never returned. The land remains too contaminated for permanent resettlement, according to assessments conducted over decades. The Nuclear Claims Tribunal, established under the Compact of Free Association, awarded approximately $2 billion in damages to the Bikinian people for the harm caused by US nuclear testing. As of the most recent reporting, only a fraction of that amount has been paid. The Nagato sits at the center of all of this: Japanese naval history, American nuclear history, Marshallese displacement, environmental contamination, and no single authority is positioned or willing to resolve any of it. The Nagato outlasted everything connected to it. It outlasted the empire that built it, the admiral who commanded it, the war it was designed to fight, the sailors who served on it, and the nuclear test that was supposed to finish it. The US personnel who watched it disappear overnight in July 1946 are gone. The Japanese officers who stood on its bridge are gone. The ship remains. It is physically present in the modern Pacific, chemically active, structurally deteriorating, and legally frozen. Assessments of the Bikini wrecks conducted over recent decades have documented ongoing structural deterioration across the fleet, and researchers broadly expect that rate to increase as the steel continues to weaken. Concern has been raised consistently that several of the hulls, including the Nagato, are approaching a point where significant structural collapse becomes increasingly likely, though precise timelines remain uncertain. When that happens, the contaminated sediment that has accumulated inside and around the inverted hull will be disturbed on a scale that the current slow oil seep does not approach. There is no remediation plan in place for that event. There is no international agreement covering it. There is no funded response waiting. The collapse, when it comes, will happen in a UNESCO World Heritage Site, in a lagoon where people dive for recreation, above a war grave that no government has formally taken responsibility for. The lagoon at Bikini Atoll looks exactly the way a remote Pacific atoll is supposed to look. The water is clear, the reef is alive, the sky is open, and the surface is calm. From above, nothing signals what is below. A boat anchored in the dive zone sits on water that is genuinely beautiful, genuinely warm, genuinely blue. Then the divers go down. At 52 meters, the Nagato fills the water around them. Inverted, massive, still recognizable as a warship despite everything. The deck faces down. The keel faces up. Coral covers the surfaces that once carried one of the most powerful naval arsenals in the Pacific. The radio room where the Pearl Harbor attack order was transmitted is somewhere in the darkness of that inverted hull, unreachable, flooded, and decaying. The oil that rises from it is not a dramatic spill. It is a slow, quiet, persistent release. Small, dark shapes drifting upward through clear water, carrying trace contamination toward a surface that looks entirely peaceful. The Marshall Islands Nuclear Claims Tribunal, the UNESCO designation, the war grave norms, the corrosion timelines, the unpaid compensation, the displaced Bikinian community, the ongoing seep. All of it is still active. All of it is still unresolved. The ship that sent the Pearl Harbor order did not end in the Pacific War. It ended up becoming a different kind of problem entirely. Quieter, slower, and with no clear end in sight.